Hi, this is Matt Baney, managing editor of the Lewiston Tribune, and this is the Lewiston Tribune podcast, episode number 6. Today we're going to talk about the elections, specifically here in Idaho, and I am joined by Laura Guido, who is our political reporter. Laura is based in Boise. She works not only for the Tribune and the Moscow-Pullman Daily News, but also the Idaho Press in Nampa, and Laura covers politics in the state year-round. And right now she's been busy writing election advances for the big election day coming up on the first Tuesday in November, on November 5th. Laura, thanks for joining us. Are you excited for Election Day coming up soon?
Oh, I'm excited for it to be done, I think. But election night coverage is always exciting. It's pretty fun. Staying up late, having some pizza.
Yes, we'll get to the important matter soon, but first let me ask you, what's the pizza scenario like at the Nampa paper? Do you guys have a pretty good spread?
Yes, because there's generally pizza eating all night. Because we're generally here till midnight or 1 a.m., so that's enough time for multiple meals worth.
And everybody should know that that's in the newspaper business. That's kind of a tradition, election night pizza. And newsrooms all over the country will be on November 5th. The staff will be eating pizza all over the country. I don't know if I've ever heard of a newspaper that didn't have election night pizza.
Me neither.
Yeah.
It's wrong.
Okay, well, Laura, looking at election season in Idaho this year, what is there a theme that kind of jumps to mind about this year's ballot? What are kind of the overarching things about this election?
Yeah, I think there's a few things. The most obvious one is it's a presidential election year. Idaho's hasn't really been particularly competitive in the presidential election for a long time, but that does mean that a lot of people will be going to the polls. The Secretary of State's office told me that they're expecting pretty high turnout, and they're kind of trying to help bolster county clerk offices to accommodate that. So can expect a lot of people voting, or at least a lot more than normal. A few other things. There's really like 4 really competitive, you might call them more purple districts in Idaho. One of them is in the Latah County area, District 6. There's an area near here in Boise, kind of on the West Boise side, and there's areas around kind of Sun Valley and Pocatello. So kind of smattered around the states, we have these really interesting races, I think, that are could really go either way. They might be really close. There's been a lot of resources put into those. I know I talked to the head of the Idaho Democrats, Laura Guido, and she said that they're putting more resources than they ever have into these, especially these races. They're kind of putting in their biggest effort ever, she said. So I think those will be interesting to watch. And then Prop 1, I think, is another thing on everyone's mind. I mean, it has the chance to totally change our election system. I mean, we've had closed primaries here, I think, since 2011, 2012-ish, and meaning, only registered Republicans can vote in Republican primaries, and this would open that up to voters of any affiliation or unaffiliated voters. We can get into the details of it later, but and then implement ranked choice voting, which has stirred a lot of strong emotions on either side of that.
Well, let's start with Prop 1. And you wrote about that in a Sunday story last week. And it's something that has started to spread a bit. Well, I don't know if you can call it spread, but there are a few other states where it's done. And you actually reached out to people in those states to ask them about it. Of course, people on both sides of it. What was your general sense from maybe asking folks in those other states how it's treated those states? And one of the states was Alaska, and remind me of the other one that you
And Maine.
And Maine. Okay, yeah. What did you get a sense of how it's gone over in those states?
Yeah, so kind of just as I've been reporting on this in general, Alaska and Maine come up a lot because they're the only other states that have implemented it statewide. There's other places that have done it, like counties or locally in cities and stuff, but they're the only two that do it statewide. I mostly talked to the former Secretary of State in Maine who was in charge of implementing it. Just to talk about how that went, because I think they were the first state to do it. And that was in 2018. And he was very knowledgeable about Maine elections. They have some interesting quirks in their state constitution, so they can't use it in the general election. They only use it for primaries. I also learned in my reporting that neither Maine nor Alaska run their elections through counties. County government is something that works differently in every state. And so everyone runs their elections really differently, and I've learned a lot about that. But what I've gathered from, and I also spoke to some reporters in Maine and Alaska as well as the Alaskan elections director. It seems like it's easy for voters to understand is a theme that I heard from everyone. They understand the mechanism of voting in a ranked choice voting election. There is confusion when it comes to understanding the results that come out. If you're doing a ranked choice tabulation, there's a chance that, when you do the first round with all 4 candidates, say, someone might come out ahead after the first round of counting. But then once you eliminate, the one with the fewest votes and reallocate those ranked choices, then someone else might end up winning. And that's where people start to get kind of wary if they're not really understanding that.
And that's interesting,
for the most part,
Laura.
Voting has gone pretty smoothly in both states.
Let me ask you too. When do they actually announce the results after each round, or how is? Do you know how that's how people see that?
Yeah. So in Maine, they did announce the results after the first round of voting, and then when it was done. In Alaska, I don't. They've only had one election under the ranked choice voting, and I don't think that they did that. So that was just the way that Maine decided to do it. And in Alaska, the results are really delayed because their elections director decided to wait, I think, like 15 days or something, because all their ballots and everything have to come into Juneau, which is not always accessible by road, so they have to wait for planes, and they have some transportation challenges there that are unique to Alaska.
No kidding. Even probably well more challenging than even in Idaho, where it can sometimes be tough to get around. And you mentioned too in that story that there is a measure in Alaska to actually go back to get rid of ranked choice voting. And it'll be interesting to see how that fares. I'm sure a lot of folks nationwide will be looking at Idaho to see how the open primaries and ranked choice voting fares in our election, and also at Alaska to see if people want to take it back. Do you have any sense for, did the folks in Alaska have any sense for how that might fare on their ballot?
Yeah, the reporter I talked to, James Brooks, said that there's a lot of money supporting ranked choice voting in Alaska. There's a lot of groups that are huge advocates for that type of election system that are supporting it. But he said it feels like there's a lot of enthusiasm, kind of grassroots enthusiasm on the repeal side of it. So he thinks it'll be close.
Okay. Well, okay, and in Idaho with this Proposition 1, can you, Laura, maybe for folks who are kind of trying to bone up before they head to the polls, I guess what are the people who are proponents of Prop 1 and the people who are opponents? Can you kind of sum up what's the argument for it, and what's the best argument against it?
Yeah, so the supporters of it have been saying that they're worried about Idaho going in kind of an extreme direction. This is their way to counter that, they say. This way, the idea is that candidates who advance in a top four open primary and use ranked choice voting have to have the majority support, not just a plurality. So you're not having people win in crowded primaries with very few people voting, with maybe 33% of the vote, which is, under the system we have now, is very possible. So their idea is, the people who are winning are having a more broad range of support, which in their mind could help, keep more extreme candidates from progressing. Opponents of it are concerned that it would be confusing. I mean, the tabulation of it is pretty different from what we do now. The Secretary of State's office has said that we'd pretty much have to buy a bunch of new equipment that's capable of tabulation with the ranked choice voting, and that could cost somewhere between $25 and $41 million, he said, which is a pretty huge range because he doesn't really know at this point how it would look to implement that here. And, there's been a lot of current officials, especially, current elected Republicans who are opposed to it. And, I talked to Luke Mayville about that, and in his mind that makes sense because, they were elected under the system we have now. So why would they want it to change? So.
And there has been the possibility that the Idaho legislature, if this passes, could perhaps repeal it or repeal part of it. That's, of course, just been talk right now. Do you? What's your best guess if this does pass? What's the likelihood that the legislature would maybe try to take back part of it, or even the whole thing?
There are some pretty powerful members of the legislature who have said that they would look into that. I think House Speaker Mike Moyle said that. It's hard to say what they would actually do. I mean, I think that overturning the will of the voters, I don't know, is the best political move. I'm not a politician, so I can't say for sure, but I think that would have to be a calculation they have to make in terms of what their constituents want and how people might react to that if this does pass.
And one thing about it, in fact, we had a bit of an error in don't worry, it wasn't anything you wrote, Laura. It was in another spot in the paper. So it would be open primaries, so anybody can vote in the primary, and then the ranked choice voting piece of it wouldn't come in until the general election. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. And anyway, it is maybe interesting that a state like Idaho, that as you described in your story, a deeply red state like Idaho, that an initiative like this has come about. I don't know. Would it be more likely to be in a state that is kind of on one end of the political spectrum, that something like this would come, or would you expect it to be in more of a toss-up state, like a swing state that gets talked about in the presidential election? I don't know. That's kind of an unfair question, maybe. But anyway, it there was a movement that at least got it on the ballot here in Idaho.
Yeah, I mean, I think what happened in Idaho is similar to what I was hearing happened in Maine and Alaska. I mean, Alaska isn't exactly a far. It's a pretty Republican state as well, but it was developed also in a similar effort to kind of counter what this, I think it was their former attorney general, saw as more extreme candidates kind of making it through the primary and crowding out more moderate Republicans from there. In Maine, what happened was there were several independent candidates, and people there felt like they were splitting the vote, the Democratic vote, and Tea Party candidates were making it through because of that, and there was a group of people that didn't think that was right. So I think that it had some of the effect that was intended, and that's part of the reason people are upset about it. I mean, for the folks who were kind of in that Tea Party camp, they stopped winning elections in Maine, as far as I could tell, or at least not winning as many. So they were upset about that because they had been previously, and at least in the one election that Alaska has run, the biggest example of a moderate who had been kind of crowded out of her primary previously was Lisa Murkowski, and in the next election she was able to make it through and then win in the general ultimately. So I would say it was having the intended effect, but whether that's a good or bad thing depends on where you are and what your priorities are. Yeah.
All right. Well, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Certainly it is. It's the biggest issue on the ballot in Idaho. There's no statewide offices that are on the ballot this year. So anyway, I think everybody's curious to see how that goes, and it is true, and even folks who are staunchly opposed to open primaries would agree, I think, that the general election is kind of an afterthought in Idaho most years. It's in the primary where things are generally decided, and I think that's maybe illustrated by you pointing out that there are 4 districts that look competitive, right?
Yeah, out of 35. So,
so that's not a lot of drama there, but we do have 4 interesting races. I guess maybe if you can't, well. First of all, I don't know. What do you, from what you gather, is that more or less than we usually have in a general election, or does that sound about how many there usually are? Is it usually just a small handful of districts that have any drama to them?
I, I don't know for sure, but I think it's been that way for a long time. I definitely know that these were kind of picked out because they were either really close or because they have mixed representation, between Democrats and Republicans currently, and that was based off of the 2022 election. Beyond that, I mean, I've only been here since 2021, so I can't really speak into much of the historical results.
Yeah. Well,
we had redistricting a couple of years ago, so the districts are all different now anyway.
That's right. And yeah, looking at the one that's in the Tribune's backyard, District 6, which consists of Latah County, part of Nez Perce County, and also Lewis County, which of course doesn't have a really big population. Tell us about those races, Laura, if you can. Who are the folks in those competitive races in District 6?
Yeah, so in the Senate race is Senator Dan Foreman, and he is facing Democrat Julia Parker. That's correct, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Okay.
Yeah, and don't worry, we'll cut Laura some slack because she's responsible for about the whole state, so it's it's okay.
I got a lot of names and numbers in my
That's
head.
right.
But, so Senator Foreman had previously served in the legislature, and then he was defeated, and then he returned in the last election. He recently made headlines because there were multiple accounts of him telling a Native American candidate of a candidate for him to go back where she came from. That kind of created a stir, and he has said that it didn't happen like that, and that he was race baited in his words, and anyway, that's been in the news. Mm-hmm. And Julia Parker is a Moscow City Council woman, and I think is a first-time candidate. And then also in that race is Representative Lori McCann is the incumbent. She's a Republican from Lewiston, and she's being challenged by Democrat Trish Carter Goodhart, and that's a rematch from 2 years ago. 2 years ago, McCann won pretty handily. I think it was with almost 60% of the vote. Representative McCann has been censured by her own party multiple times, mostly because of votes regarding libraries. There was a few library bills the last few years kind of seeking to limit materials deemed harmful for minors, which just means has like sexual content in it. Basically in the law, and she had been pretty staunchly opposed to legislating that in a way that would open up lawsuits to these libraries, which almost all the bills included, except for the first one, which would have been jail time. So she also has been opposed to these called school choice bills that would allow taxpayer money to go towards private school tuition. And her stance on that has been, she said she's open to conversations about it, but so far she hasn't seen a proposal that would come with a level of accountability that she's comfortable with. So that's been a major issue. And then Carter Goodhart similarly also made headlines recently because she was the one who the informant reportedly told to go back where she came from, and she's a member of the Nez Perce tribe and from Labway, and she apparently told Representative McCann, where am I supposed to go in response to that, because she's from here and her people are from here.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's also Representative Brandon Mitchell, who is being challenged by Kathy Dawes, and Dawes is a retired educator. They similarly, or not similarly, but they have a different stance on the school choice issue, although Mitchell hasn't had a chance to vote on it yet. And I think in our interview, he hasn't said necessarily which way he would go. He hasn't really had to weigh in on one of those proposals yet. But that's a major kind of theme in this election, is those who are in favor of those type of proposals with education, and then those who think that the public money should stay in public schools.
Yeah, thank you, Laura, for the breakdown there. If you could talk a little about the school choice issue, and it does seem to, in these competitive races, it sounds like is that maybe one of the issues that really is separating candidates, is their stance on school choice and vouchers.
Yes, in many of them it has, and that was also true for the primary, because it's an issue that I think has a varied. The Republicans in Idaho have differing opinions on it, and how much we should do it, or if we do it, how we should do it, and so it definitely divides the Republican Party. So it's been an issue since the primary, and there's a lot of money that goes into supporting these proposals. There's a large organization called the American Federation for Children, and it's one of the top lobbying spenders in Idaho for these types of legislation, and spends a lot of money in elections, and spent a lot of money opposing people who were opposed to those. So it's just something that's been talked about a lot, and because there's so much money in it, I think it makes the stakes a little higher for some of these candidates.
Okay. Could you talk a little about the Lori McCann, Trish Carter Goodhart race? Now that's interesting. As you mentioned, Lori maybe lost some support among the Republican base, but does that mean that those folks are going to vote for Trish, a Democrat? What do you think about that scenario?
I would say among the Republican base, that's unlikely, because she was essentially censured for, her party central committees in different counties were saying she wasn't adhering closely enough to the Republican platform. So it's unlikely they would think a Democrat would adhere more to it. So I do think that it's unlikely that if she lost any votes among those actions, that they would go towards Carter Goodhart.
Okay. Elsewhere in the state, Laura, in some of those other competitive races, any in particular have you really interested? Or any of them got anything unique about them, or just any that just have piqued your interest in particular?
We have a Senate race here for District 15 between the incumbent Senator, Democrat Rick Just, and a former lawmaker, Cody Galloway. That one's just interesting because it's a rematch from 2 years ago, and that race 2 years ago was very close. And both candidates have raised a lot more money and spent a lot more money than I've seen in other legislative races around the state. And I wrote the story a while ago, so it's probably more now. But the last time I looked, they were in the approaching 80,000 range, which for a legislative race is a lot more than I typically see.
Yeah.
And they were both spending quite a bit as well. So I think that race is going to be very competitive.
Well, and you'll be busy covering a lot of the results, I'm sure, on election night. You mentioned early on in our chat that, of course, this is a presidential election year. Who do you think is going to win Idaho, Laura?
Well, if I was a betting person, which I am not, I don't make enough money to bet, but I would guess the former president is probably has an edge in Idaho.
Yes. It's always interesting, too, with voting. Like you mentioned, we'll expect a big turnout, but people are excited, of course, to vote in a presidential race. Of course, the votes, especially in this state, don't really matter. I hate to say that, but we kind of know who's going to win. Anyway, how is it we can get through to people that it's really those the more local the race becomes, the more important their vote is. It just as an observer of elections, I wish that was a lesson that voters would realize that they have more sway over their some of the elections that often don't get a big turnout.
Yeah, I think it's important for people to understand that the government closest to them has the biggest impact on their everyday life. I mean, it's easier to maybe find information or be excited or not excited about the presidential election, but ultimately, the problems a lot of people have daily, their property taxes, what goes on at their libraries, their income taxes, things like that, roads, those are all dealt with at a more local level. So making sure they're paying attention to who's representing them right now it's the legislative races, which has a pretty big impact on how the state is run and has kind of a trickle-down effect on local government as well, but also making sure you're paying attention to those off-year votes, or if you have school board elections, those affect your property taxes. Things like that tend to affect us more than we realize.
Right. All right. Thanks, Laura. One last question for you. What's your favorite kind of pizza? What do you hope the Idaho Press will be serving on election night?
Well, my last name's Guido, so I love all pizza, but I'm a particular fan of pepperoni, olive, and green pepper.
Well, do I need to put in a call to Teddy Feinberg and tell him to make sure to have that variety?
Oh, I'll let him know for sure.
Okay, good. All right. Hey, Laura, thank you very much for your insight. That was great stuff. You can check out, Laura has written several of our candidate profiles, and she also, her piece that was in the Tribune on October 20th was really interesting, that talked about Proposition 1 and some of the competitive legislative races as well. So, Laura, thanks a lot again for joining us, and thanks everybody out there for listening to the Lewiston Tribune podcast. Be sure to come back next week for our next episode. Thank you.